As such, you are as good as the all-pervasive Supersoul. Please, therefore, find out the deficiency in me, despite my being absorbed in transcendence under disciplinary regulations and vows. Purport by Srila Prabhupada. Transcendental realization, pious activities, worshipping the deities, charity, mercifulness, non-violence, and studying the scriptures under strict disciplinary regulations are all always helpful. So, chapter 8, verse 8. Has everybody got either on their iPhone or... It's not written up anyway. They don't do that anymore here. Okay, well, let's try it. So text 8. Sri Narada Uvacha Bhavata Nudita Prayam Yasho Bhagavaton Malam Yenaiva So Na Tushita Manye Tad Darshanam Kilam Sri Narada Uvacha Bhavatu Nudita Prayam Yasho Bhagavato Malam Yenaivaso Natusheta. So we'll do that one again. Yenaivaso Natusheta Manyeta Darshanam Kilim Sri Narada Uvacha Bhavata Nudita Prayam Yasho Bhagavato Malam Yenaiva Vaso Natusheta Manyeta Darshanam Kilam. Somebody. Sri Narada Uvacha Bhavata Nuditam Prayam Yasho Bhagavato Malam Yenaivaso Natusheta Manyeta Darshanam Kilam. Sri Narada Uvacha Bhavata Nudita Prayam Yasho Bhagavato Malam Yenaivaso Natusheta Manyeta Darshanam Kilam. Ladies, anyone? Bhavata Nudita Prayam Yasho Bhagavato Malam Yenaivaso Natusheta Manyeta Darshanam Kilam. Sri Narada Uvacha Bhavata Nudita Prayam Yaso Bhagavato Malam. Manyeta Darshanam Kilam. Sri Narada Uvacha said, Bhavata by you, Anudita Prayam almost not praised, Yasha glories, Bhagavataha, of the personality of Godhead. Amalam, spotless. Yena, by which. Eva, certainly. Aso, he, the personality of Godhead. Na, does not. Tujyeta, be pleased. Manye, I think. Tat, that. Darshanam, philosophy. Kilam, inferior. Sri Narada said, you have not actually broadcast the sublime and spotless glories of the personality of Godhead. That philosophy which does not satisfy the transcendental senses of the Lord is considered worthless. I'll just read that one more time. Sri Narada said, you have not actually broadcast the sublime and spotless glories of the personality of Godhead. That philosophy which does not satisfy the transcendental senses of the Lord is considered worthless. Purport. The eternal relation of an individual soul with the Supreme Soul personality of Godhead is constitutionally one of being the eternal servitor of the eternal Master. The Lord has expanded himself as living beings in order to accept loving service from them, and this alone can satisfy both the Lord and the living beings. Such a scholar as Vyasadeva has completed many expansions of the Vedic literatures, ending with Vedanta philosophy, but none of them have been written directly glorifying the personality of Godhead. Dry philosophical speculations, even on the transcendental subject of the Absolute, have very little attraction without directly dealing with the glorification of the Lord. The personality of Godhead is the last word in transcendental realization. The Absolute realized as impersonal Brahman, or localized Supersoul, Paramatma, is less productive of transcendental bliss than the supreme personal realization of his glories. The compiler of Vedanta Darshan is Vyasadeva himself, yet he is troubled, although he is the author. So what sort of transcendental bliss can be derived by the readers and listeners of Vedanta, which is not explained directly by Vyasadeva, the author? Herein arises the necessity of explaining Vedanta Sutra in the form of the Srimad Bhagavatam by the self-same author. Sri Narada said, you have not actually broadcast the sublime and spotless glories of the personality of Godhead. That philosophy which does not satisfy the transcendental senses of the Lord is considered worthless. Okay, so an important comment there. Prabhupada says that the necessity of explaining Vedanta Sutra in the form of Srimad Bhagavatam by the self-same author. Vyasadeva, I was just reading this morning, Vyas means to split, or divide. So Vyasadeva is that sage that divided up transcendental knowledge into different sections. The four Veda, of course, the Itihasas, the Puranas, etc., etc. So he's done so much work to delineate and clarify what this world is, what we are as living beings, what is the supreme absolute shelter of the living beings. So he's done all of this and still he's not satisfied. but he can't quite put his finger on the problem. So Narada Muni comes and tells him straight away that you haven't directly glorified the Supreme Lord. Yeah, you've said so many things, but the peak of understanding is to understand that the Lord, or the Supreme, is in fact a person. And that person has all the attributes that we can observe in this material world in the living beings here. He has that in perfection. So the understanding of personality gets down to senses. Prabhupada says here that he hasn't yet satisfied the transcendental senses of the Lord. So any philosophical path, any kind of speculation, that has to conclude, or it reaches its perfection when there's an understanding of the Supreme Lord as a person. Yeah, we have Brahman, we have Paramatma, but Bhagavan iti sabhyate, the personality of Godhead. He has all the senses, and through those transcendental senses, he generates the living beings, and they reciprocate with him in different ways. So there are different kinds of senses, but because the Supreme Lord has senses, then we also have senses. Yeah, the so-called material scientists, they fall short. They're actually Mayavadis, but they have no understanding not only of matter, but they have no understanding of the transcendental nature of the living being. We're embodied in this material world, but we have no realization or understanding of what's beyond our sense perception. But the Supreme Lord, his sense perception is unlimited. The senses are the means or the gateways by which information comes to stimulate the mind. When the mind is stimulated, then it employs the intelligence to try and enjoy in this material world. This is the position of living beings, conditioned living souls. So without the senses working, then practically we become inert. Yeah. Indriyani paraniyaho, indriyabriya pramana, manasastu para buddhi, yo buddhe paratas tu saha. This is from the Bhagavad Gita 342. So it describes the hierarchy of the living beings. The working senses are superior to dull matter. The mind is higher than the senses. Intelligence is still higher than the mind. And he, the soul, is even higher than the intelligence. So this is a nice, simple way to describe the makeup of a living being. First of all, there's dull matter. But that dull matter, it stimulates or provides information for the senses. So the senses are interacting with dull matter. When the senses are employed, then the next thing is the mind is activated. So through the mind, then we decide what we want to do. The mind itself, it doesn't act on its own, but it acts with direction. Although information is coming in from dull matter, the mind has to, process that information. It has to do something with it. So there are different senses, and by the variety of the senses working on the mind, then we experience so-called happiness and distress in this material world. Without the senses working, then the living being can't function. Yeah. There's always input from material nature in through the different senses, your eyes, your ears, the tongue, taste, touch, like this. So this information is coming in, it gets processed by the mind. But what to do with it? The mind is not a final decision maker. It employs the intelligence, and the intelligence, with intelligence, a living being can act in this material world. There were some experiments that were done, because the scientists are always experimenting. But in the 1930s and 40s, 1950s, there was a lot of interest in brainwashing. They had the Korean War, and then the Chinese were fighting. So they did some experiments, and we had the phenomena of so-called brainwashing, where American troops were sometimes captured by the North Koreans, and they would be what they call brainwashed, which means that the senses and the mind was reprogrammed, if you like. And then these men were put up on the TV that this man was formerly an American, now he's in favor of North Korea, like this. We also had the same thing with our devotees when we first started Street Sankirtan. Yeah, we were accused by the parents that the Krishna consciousness movement is brainwashing our children. So brainwashing in the sense that they reprogrammed the minds through sensory deprivation. That was the key thing. Sometimes an overload of information comes, or sometimes no information comes. Either way, it causes distress to the living beings. Everybody has got senses. According to the Mahabharata, every living being has the five main senses. And I think, who was it? The associate of Dr. Bose in Calcutta, he did some experiments on plants. So one of the experiments was that a particular plant was planted in a greenhouse. There was a box of plants on one side and another box on the other side. So initially, plants were being fed every day, watered, and they would play nice music. And the person that was looking after the plants, he was, speaking to them, talking to them, and the plants were growing nicely. Then one day he came in with his sword or a stick or some cutting instrument, and he just wiped out, without warning, he wiped out all the plants on one side of the greenhouse. And then the other ones, he continued on with the program of, stimulating them. But what they did, what they found was that whilst he was killing all the plants on one side, the plants on the other side started freaking out. Yeah, they got very troubled, like mass anxiety. And then afterwards, he would come and still feed them. But every time somebody came in through the door, the remaining plants, they were, disturbed, anxious. Gradually, over time, they settled down. There was no further murdering of the fellow plants, and they started to grow nicely again. So this was an experiment that they did to show that plants have senses. Yeah. If you can't hear or touch or feel and taste, then you're in trouble. There was another one that was done I think in the 60s or 70s, same thing, a repeat of the same experiment, except with trees instead of a small planted living entity. They found that when they set forth a particular kind of bug that eats these trees, so as soon as the tree detected that there was these bugs coming and attacking, so then they immediately started to secrete this sap, a particular kind of sap, which would be distasteful to the ants, and so the ants would avoid it. So it's a clear case of the trees defending themselves. They had some sense that this is an enemy, and responded by producing this particular kind of sap. But then, to their surprise, they found that not only did the tree that was being attacked produce this sap, but all the trees in a certain periphery, they all, in response, also started producing the same sap, although they were not being attacked by the ants. So these are indications. The trees have consciousness. They can understand what's going on, albeit in a crude way. But all plants have these senses by which they gather information, and then by which they respond or interact with the material elements. So in that way then, the Mahabharata also, there's some description there that every living being has senses. And with those senses, then they're interacting with the sense objects. So here it's saying in the verse there that he's trying to please the transcendental senses of the Supreme Lord. So we cannot function without the senses being in good order. If the senses are not functioning properly, it becomes impossible to act. So that's not just a material phenomena. Of course, the Mayavadis, they, realizing that this material world is a horrible place, a disturbed place, then they deny the existence of the Supreme Lord. They deny the existence of the material elements, the existence of individual living beings. They want to make everything all one. They want to stop the functioning of the senses. That's their idea. Yeah. They realize, or they perceive, that problems and distress come from material nature acting on the senses acting on the mind acting on the intellect. So their idea of attaining bliss, which means not being disturbed anymore in so many different ways. So their idea is that you bring yourself to a point of neutrality where the senses no longer can disturb. And then with that, then you merge with the undifferentiated Brahman. But there's no question of personality. In the Mayavadi philosophy, what they're doing is denying the personality of Godhead as senses. So in that way then, in their next lives, the Mayavadis take birth as trees and stones. Yeah, because as a stone, practically speaking, there's no stimulus for the senses. There's no sensory activity, barely. Same with trees, of course they have some. But not being able to act through the senses, there's no question of getting any happiness. Pursuit of happiness is the business of human life especially, but all living beings. We're all looking for happiness, but we're not getting it. So Krishna gives a prescription by which those senses that we have can be utilized to come to an ultimate state of bliss. Manmana bhavamad bhakto majyajim nam namaskaru. Manmana, think of me. Because Krishna is a transcendental person, he has transcendental senses. And he invites the living beings to engage their senses with his senses. And by doing so, they begin to experience transcendental bliss. And once that becomes firmly fixed, Manmano, Krishna says, think of me. This is the solution to the problems of the world. Everybody's being driven by the contact of their senses with dull matter. So if you want to go beyond that, if you want to come to the platform of real happiness, then we have to engage or do practical service, engaging our senses with the senses of the Supreme Lord. As soon as that's attained, then you become fixed. When there's a reciprocation between the living beings through their senses with the Supreme Living Being through his senses, then you have the state of perpetual bliss, Ananda. So in that way then, so far, Vyasadeva has not yet described the transcendental leelas and pastimes. And that's what's missing. That's why he's feeling a bit incomplete. He's written down all the rest of the Vedic knowledge, highly technical, volumes and volumes, different subject matters, and ultimately culminating in Vedanta Sutra. But he has not got to the point of activity in spiritual life. So that, therefore, Narada's come to tell him now that this is your mistake. You have not glorified the transcendental senses and the activities of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So there were some experiments actually done in the 60s and again in 2008. Some university lecturers, they were experimenting to see what happens when your senses are malfunctioning or not functioning at all. So they did these, it's quite interesting. They did these experiments whereby they prevented the senses from any contact with dull matter, with matter. So what they did was that they got a few students and they put them in soundproof rooms, and they wrapped up their hands with cardboard cuffs that extended beyond the reach of their hands. They blocked off the sound. They blocked off any vision of anything. They were put in these chambers where there's no light, there's no noise, no activity at all. And then they were left there for some time. So what happened was that within a few hours, the students became, it says here, acutely restless just after a couple of hours of sensory deprivation. They started to crave stimulation, talking, singing, or reciting poetry to themselves to break the monotony. Many of them became anxious or highly emotional. Their mental performance suffered too, struggling with arithmetic and word association tests. So this was practically within an hour or two of having their senses, deprived of contact with matter. Then a further symptom was that they experienced hallucinations. And these would often start with points of light, lines or shapes, eventually evolving into bizarre scenes, such as seeing squirrels marching with sacks over their shoulders, or processions of eyeglasses proceeding down a street. They had no control over what they saw. One man saw only dogs, another babies. So these are all bizarre phenomena coming from the mind. With the senses, being cut off, then the person lost control, lost all sense of who they were. They became distressed to an acute degree. So when they emerged from the experiment, they found it hard to shake the altered sense of reality. And they were convinced that the whole room was in motion, or that objects were constantly changing shape and size. So these are all distortions of consciousness. And they get distorted when they're not properly engaged. When the senses are not properly engaged, the mind becomes frantic. And you lose all sense of who you are, where you are, what you're supposed to be doing. So that was done in the 1960s, that experiment. In 2008, they did some more experiments, a different set of scientists this time. And they isolated 6 volunteers for 48 hours in a soundproof rooms in a former nuclear bunker. The results were similar. The volunteers suffered anxiety, extreme emotions, paranoia, and significant deterioration of their mental functions. They also hallucinated. One saw a heap of 5,000 empty oyster shells. Another a snake, zebras, tiny cars, the room taking off, mosquitoes, fighter planes buzzing around. These are all different things that they were seeing, all within the mind. So the researchers had hoped to observe their subjects over several weeks, but the trial was cut short because the subjects became too distressed to carry on. Few of them lasted beyond 2 days, and none of them as long as 1 week. So function of the senses is kind of crucial. If your senses don't function properly, then you lose all sense of cognition, who you are, what you are, where you come from, anything. And information that's stored in the mind, it becomes distorted. Prabhupada once, I was giving him his massage in Vrindavan, and usually he didn't speak when we were giving him massage, but all of a sudden, without any prompt, he said, "I had a dream last night." So I said, "Oh, what was that, Srila Prabhupada?" He said, "Well, I dreamt that the courtyard in Krishna Balaram Mandir was suddenly filled with water to the top. And that I was thinking, oh, if it goes even 1 inch more higher, then everything will be flooded and ruined." So I asked Prabhupada, I said, "Is that real?" Or, because it's Prabhupada, of course. So I asked him, was that actually something that's going to happen, or what is it? Prabhupada said, "No, it's all just nonsense." He said, "That is the mind." He said he took a hold of the bottle of mustard oil that I was massaging him with in it. He said, "Now if I take this oil and then I put it under the pillow on my bed, does it make any sense?" So he said, "This is just the mind, because when you're asleep, it's a similar kind of thing. You've got no input from the senses whilst you're asleep, but the mind is working. So the mind dredges up because it has to have stimulus. It has to have stimulus to work properly. So it dredges up images that have been seen before and mixes them all up with no priority attached. It's just like a jumble of thoughts. So the senses then, dealing with the senses, is very important. Yeah, we have to be very careful how we engage the senses, and that will decide that will give us a priority on how to bring the mind to this point. Manmana bhavamad bhakto. Think of Krishna. There are some people that have been subjected to extremes of sensory deprivation. One lady was captured as a spy. She was put in a solitary confinement for 10 years. So when they finally let her out, they interviewed her, and she was more or less functioning okay, even after 10 years alone in solitary confinement. But the way that she kept her sanity was she created mathematical problems in her mind and then spent her time trying to solve them. So she could speak like 4 or 5 languages, and she was a good mathematician, so she engaged her mind in a particular activity, and that stopped her from going crazy. There was also, I read a story about a priest. He was preaching in some country, and there was a revolution. So the incoming government, they arrested this priest, put him in jail in a room about 6 by 8, 6 foot by 10 foot, something like that, very small. And they left him there. So he spent 8 years in this confinement with no contact with anybody else except the people that would just come and give him some food to eat, and that was it. So for 8 years he was trapped in this situation. Then that government, got thrown out, another government came in, so they released him. And they were surprised. He was smiling, he was happy. And they asked him, how is it that you're okay? Practically speaking, anybody that gets put in solitary confinement, they go crazy. But you're not crazy, why is that? So he said, well, because he's a priest, he said, I've always accepted that I am the servant of the Supreme. So whatever situation I get put into, I accept this is by arrangement of the Supreme Lord. If he doesn't agree for something to happen, it doesn't happen. If he wants something to happen, nobody can stop it. So I've always understood that the Lord is my best friend. So when I was put into the cell, then I accepted immediately. This couldn't have happened unless the Lord agreed for it to happen. So he said, by keeping my focus on my friendship with the Lord, then I was okay. So this is, because he didn't know who the Lord is, but he knew there was something higher than himself. So this is the way to deal with the senses, is to engage them in some higher purpose, or some kind of alternate purpose, if you like. So we're here in this material world. We experience, so many ups and downs, changes of mind, consciousness. We all experience it, from moment to moment practically. The mind is always agitating or being agitated, and the senses are all pulling this way, that way. Oh, look and see, here's something beautiful, some nice smell. As soon as we get attracted to the sense objects, then we forget who we really are. And whatever we meditate on, then the tendency is that you become engaged or interactive with the object of your meditation. So, the material world as a whole, it's designed by Krishna to facilitate these rebellious living beings to come back to proper consciousness. So the way that he does that is that he engages the three modes of material nature to influence the combinations of matter that a living being gets in the form of its body and mind and intellect. So the Supreme Lord arranges, according to our desire, this place of, well, we can say it's an illusion, but he employs the stuff of material nature to interact with the living beings and give them what they desire. But at the same time, he tries to offer them something higher. So if we remain on the lower platform, thinking that we are this body, we are, parts and parcels of the material world, if we think like that, then naturally there's not going to be any happiness involved. Nobody can be happy by merely engaging the senses with ordinary matter, because the nature of matter is that it's constantly changing. There's no fixed situation. So that way then, if we want to get to a platform of continuous happiness, we have to find out how to engage the senses on an eternal platform. The senses, if we just try to get rid of them or ignore them, or just like as the Mayavadis and impersonalists do, the end result is distress. It's not happiness, just to stop the senses from working. They're right in thinking that the senses are the cause of so many trials and tribulations. We see people suffering due to losing control of their senses. So the impetus from that kind of situation, it should be that we transcend the senses rather than just ignore them. If we transcend them, that means Prabhupada describes or defines Bhakti Yoga as being devotional service. Devotional service means action, means activity in relationship to the Lord. So that's the proper platform that one can attain happiness on. You leave all the material interactions behind, but you engage your senses and mind in something higher. So this hierarchy that's described, Indriyani Paraniyaho, Indriya Paramana, Manasastu Parabuddhi, Yo Buddhe Paratastu Saha. If we understand that properly, then we can act in such a way that we become fixed on a platform of pure happiness. When we understand how the material world is working, this hierarchy, hierarchical arrangement, then instead of pointing our attention to something lower, we can point it to something higher. So once it's fixed on that platform, it becomes eternal. And then the consciousness that we developed by practicing fixing in our minds on Krishna, that consciousness carries us back to the spiritual world. So Krishna consciousness movement, understanding that the Supreme Lord is a fully conscious living being and has all the sensual attributes that we see in ordinary living beings in this material world. So, there's a comment there by Prabhupada. Devotees worship Rishikesh. This is one of the names that Krishna addresses Arjuna, I think in the first chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, verse 15 or something. But he tells him Rishikesh, he calls him Rishikesh. So Rishikesh means the master of the senses. So the ultimate goal then is to engage our senses in relationship to the Supreme Lord's senses. When we do that, then we're fully fixed. We're not disturbed by the movements of matter anymore. There's no more birth and death for a devotee. It's all the same because he's enjoying his relationship with Krishna. So a pure devotee, they're not dictated to by the senses, but they are actually in a situation. Prabhupada says in the purport here that Rishikesha, Isha of course means controller, master. So Krishna, the Lord, who directs the senses of the devotees, that's Rishikesh. So the Lord, situated in the hearts of all living entities, directs their senses. So ordinary living beings also, their sensual stimulation and transference from one material situation to another, anywhere in the universe. So everybody has that, or is under the control of the Lord, because he's within the heart of every living being. But in the case of a pure devotee, Prabhupada says, he directly controls the senses. So Krishna, he permits the living beings to have what they want, but he doesn't directly engage with them. Yeah, he has other means with which to give the living beings what they want. But with the pure devotees, he personally controls their senses as well as his own. So that's what we want to get up to, that point where Krishna is apparent and interactive. So we can worship the Lord, we can think of the Lord, we can practice devotional service to the Lord in different ways and means. Manoratein artati. Prabhupada used to quote that verse a lot. Mano, the mind. It's like the pivotal point, so the emphasis always keep your mind engaged. If we keep the mind engaged in Krishna's service, then this transference of responsibility comes about, where Krishna takes direct control of his devotees. Okay, I'm going to finish at this point. Does anybody have any questions or comments?
Engaging our senses in the service of the Lord, but when we leave a body at that time, we engage our senses in the service of the Lord.
Yeah.
That means they always, it'll transcendental. But at the time of leaving the body, you don't have any senses. We're just left with the mind. And what will happen? Our fate may be like those in the experiment. We go.
No, but why do you say that when you leave the body there's no more senses?
No, but you don't have senses. You don't have senses, physical senses anymore.
No, you don't have the physical matter.
Right.
That's the objects of the senses.
Yes.
But the living being himself, he retains the intelligence, mind, and senses.
But it's the mind and the intelligence that carries you to the next body.
Well, the mind is considered the sixth sense.
Yes. But you're left alone at that stage. Are you left alone with the mind?
No, the mind is always there, but it's according to the situation that it finds itself in. Then it performs certain activities, and you get a body which will support. You have your desires. The desires are within the mind. The senses interact with the sense objects, and then you can operate in the material world.
Yeah. But in between, when you first leave, you're just with the mind, right, and intelligence. That's the subtle body which takes you to the. So there's no other senses to use, or.
Well,
are we just left alone with the mind? Is that what it is?
It's not just the mind. The senses are always there. That we have a spiritual body. So even though we might look like we're situated in this material body, but even the material body of a pure devotee, it deteriorates and follows the same patterns as those for ordinary living beings. But the senses, the mind, the intellect of a pure devotee, they're engaged in spiritual practice and activity, interactions. So we don't lose that. It's not like there's some kind of a void position where the senses are neither in the material form or spiritual form. The senses are part of the material, the senses are ultimately, as the mind is, part of the transcendental nature. When you come into the material world, instead of getting your happiness from Krishna and being engaged in Krishna's activities, leelas, you come into the material world, that part gets covered over. You forget that. But you still have to act. You still have to, the starting point for any living being is the spiritual world. We've all come from there. So whatever we had in the spiritual world, senses, mind, and intellect, that just gets covered over. In the material world, then, because the forms that we have, the spiritual forms that we have in the spiritual world, are according to how we would like to serve Krishna. And he fulfills that desire. Somebody becomes a servant, somebody becomes a gopi, somebody becomes a parent, whatever. In the leelas, the rasas, then we have a perfected form there. If we come to the material world, we don't lose that, but it just gets covered over. So the idea of transmigrating from one body to another, or one species to another, whatever, that's due to forgetfulness, but it's not due to a lack. Yeah, we're not lacking senses in the spiritual world. It's already there. But in the material world, we are obliged by the modes of material nature and by what Sadaputa used to call the stuff of matter, the stuff of the universe. So that requirement that a living being has, it's fulfilled by generation of new forms. So you travel from one form to another, but at no point do you lose what you are. Yeah, it only appears that way. What you are is an eternal living being engaged in, pastimes of enjoyment. So take Krishna out of the picture. It doesn't mean that we lose what we are. Our forms are actually eternal. But in the material world, we use the material energy, to fulfill certain purposes and to receive, reactions for those purposes that are deemed to be harmful to other living beings. So you take everything, you take your desires and your karma. You take karma and karma.
Karma and?
K-A-M-A. You take your karma and karma, your desire and your, the results of your activities. That propels you on in the material world. But the nature of the soul is fixed. You don't lose your senses just because they're not acting through matter.
We don't lose the spiritual senses, but now they're covered. We forget them now. We're identifying with the external senses. So that's a medium we have to. I'm in relation to the students' experiment, where they go crazy if you're deprived of those senses. So all we know now is the material senses, unless we don't understand our spiritual senses. So we're identifying with the material senses. So when the body's taken away, we don't have that. We're just left with the mind, isn't it? It's not that your spiritual senses suddenly kick in, and unless you're a pure devotee.
But the senses are always present, whether they're acting or, temporarily suspended. But the senses are always there. And as soon as you get into another body...
Yeah, but you can't use those senses, can you?
Huh?
You can't use the senses. You have no medium to express your senses.
Why not?
You don't have a body. You're in the subtle body of the mind and intelligence. It takes you from one body to another.
It's just, when the soul transmigrates, then he's immediately awarded a new material body. But the senses and the mind that he had in his previous body are retained. The senses are working under control of the mind. The subtle body of a living being is not just mind and intelligence, it's the senses also, but the senses are inert for some time, but not permanently. But being inert doesn't mean it's not there. They're just not acting. As soon as a living being is put into the womb of another mother, from the very first time of entry, the cells immediately begin to double up. Within 2 or 3 months, you've got a perfectly formed, let's say, human, but not yet able to act independently. But it's growing, it's just a matter of time. And within that, those cells that, start off so small you can hardly perceive them, everything is there, and it gets revealed as the baby grows with the push of time. Then it gets revealed what kind of living being is going to be in this, So the senses become activated right from the point of the entry of the embryo. Anybody who's had kids, I was just speaking with my older daughter, yesterday. So she had a baby girl about a year ago. And whenever you see them, especially little kids, they just grow very rapidly. And the senses are immediately active. Of course, up until the 7th month in the womb, there's no display of consciousness. But from the 7th month onwards, the baby, actually starts displaying activity. You can see they're breathing, they've got their hands, little tiny fingers, fingernails, everything's there. So they're just, it's a question of time. When they're born, very rapidly, their sensual activity is displayed. So they've always had the senses before even entering into the womb. They're just not able to act, so they're put into a kind of stage of, Prabhupada describes it as like a sleep. You die, you go to sleep, you wake up in another body. So the senses are an essential part of the spiritual form. So they're not lost, the living being doesn't have to wait to get his senses from contact with material nature. He already has it. And conditioned souls, of course, they have so many repeated births and deaths. So there's an accumulation of matter and reactions that they have to, or that becomes manifest when they become a little independent. But just because you can't see them, and it's like the soul transmigrates to another mother's womb. So that for the first initial period in the womb, they're unconscious. The body's growing rapidly, and all the senses with it, the eye, the eyes, the nose, the ears, everything is there in there. But they're not able to use it until they're woken up. So at a certain point they do start to wake up. And let's say, I read a story about pregnant women. So with the babies in the womb, at a certain point, the babies can hear what's going on outside. That's why in India, it's traditional. All the pregnant women, they come to the temple and they hear the kirtan, they hear the bells. So this creates some input through their senses, even though they're within the womb. And then when they come out of the womb, when they hear that sound, immediately they're alert. What's that? I heard it before. They found that in the West, pregnant women, because generally they're not working, they're at home. So they have on the TV these midday dramas, soapbox. Yeah, I think they call them a soapbox opera. So they have these dramas. So women that have nothing to do, they sit and they watch the telly. So then they found that when the babies are born, because the mothers were regularly watching, particular shows, and those shows have musical background, some key tune that you can identify, or that, this show is coming on. So the babies, when they're born, when they hear the theme tune of some of these shows that the parents have been watching, the mother's been watching, immediately they become alert. They recognize it, because they can't express that they have, but from their, bodily reactions. So the point is that the senses are working even within the womb. There may be a dormant period, but at a certain point of development, the senses are allowed, to be utilized actively, consciously. Is that all right? We're supposed to finish at 9, sorry. All right, sorry, but that's the end of the class. Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai.